I'm here at the VegMed conference in Berlin, Germany, the 2018 VegMed. And it's just an outstanding conference. It'd be nice to see it flourish in other areas, have VegMed in every country. But the topic that I was asked to speak on today was diabetes, type 2 diabetes specifically. And it's an area that is really very near and dear to my heart. Because on my father's side of my family, there's a tremendous amount of diabetes. My father died of diabetes. And also because I work with a population called the Marshall Islands in the Pacific that has among the highest rates of diabetes in the world. And how I love the people of the Marshall Islands. They are the most joyful, these super high-spirited, lovely human beings, and they are wiping themselves out with diabetes. It's absolutely a tragedy. Probably over half the population has either diabetes or pre-diabetes. I have a very special interest in diabetes, and so you know, if you look around the world, just since the 1980s, we've doubled the incidence of diabetes. We are now at close to 9% of the population has diabetes. In North America, the United States specifically, somewhere between 49 and 52% of the adult population has either diabetes or pre-diabetes. And pre-diabetes is just a slightly lower blood sugar before you have full-blown diabetes, but many people with pre-diabetes do develop type 2 diabetes. So half the population, this is just astounding. And so it's a situation that's very concerning. And in terms of growth in diabetes throughout the world, the countries that are at the greatest risk, that are projected to increase 100% or more, are actually the poorest countries in the world, who are increasing their intake of processed foods and animal products. And so it's a very concerning situation. Now, one thing we see is, you know, I mentioned 12 to 14% of Americans have diabetes. About 9% of the global population has diabetes. Well, within the vegetarian population, we see much smaller numbers. So, for example, in the Adventist Health Study 2, 3.2% of lacto-ovo vegetarians have diabetes, and 2.9% of vegans have diabetes. And if you follow the vegetarians and vegans that are diabetes-free for a couple of years to see who develops diabetes relative to very similar health-conscious omnivores, controlling for exercise and smoking and drinking and all of that sort of thing, vegans have 62% lower risk and vegetarians have a 38% lower risk, lacto-ovo vegetarians. So they are tremendously protected, even when we control for things like, you know, as I mentioned, exercise and so forth. So this is really very, very significant. We also have studies that have looked at using a plant-based diet as treatment for diabetes. And we see really quite remarkable results. So we've got the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine that has done a number of randomized controlled trials that have shown that a low-fat vegan diet is a lot more powerful in treating diabetes than a standard conventional diet. There's a group in the Czech Republic that has done similar studies that has shown very good results. In the Marshall Islands, we did 5 interventions comparing control, doing usual care, versus people receiving a very intensive lifestyle intervention. And we saw in 12 weeks an A1C drop of almost 2 points on average, which is really quite remarkable. So we had very, very good results. And I was back in 2014, we had blood glucose drops of over 6 millimoles per liter on average in our participants in that intervention. So you know, when you put together a plant-based diet well, what happens is you're essentially disabling the drivers of insulin resistance, which is the big cause of type 2 diabetes. So when you look at the drivers, inflammation, oxidative stress, lipotoxicity, and dysbiosis, These are all factors that a plant-based diet just literally puts an end to. So people who are on plant-based diets have less inflammation, they have less oxidative stress, they have better, healthier gut microbiota, and they have far less lipotoxicity. And so you know, when you do a really well-constructed plant-based diet, you put an end to, or at least you put a huge dent in those drivers of diabetes. And so today we talked about all of those things, but we also talked about, so how do you design a diet that will really provide maximum protection? Number one is people need to recognize that all diets, whether they're omnivorous diets or whether they're vegetarian diets, there are good and or healthy and unhealthy patterns. So you can do a vegan diet where you're living off French fries and soda. And that is not going to contribute to health. That's not going, it could be much worse than a healthy omnivorous diet where you're eating lots of fruits and vegetables and whole grains and beans and a little bit of meat. You could do much better than a vegan eating potato chips and soda. So the diet needs to be well designed, but a well-designed plant-based diet actually maximizes the components in the diet that are most protective and minimizes the components in the diet that are most harmful. And so what you need to do is, number one, is you make whole plant foods the foundation of the diet. So you're wanting to be consuming at least 9 or 10 servings of vegetables and fruits a day. And you want those foods to be, you know, wide-ranging, a big variety, colorful. I always say all the colors of the rainbow, where you're having, you know, at least 3 dark greens, 2 orange red, 2 purple blue, you know, or 1 purple blue, I think 2 orange yellow, and 2 red pink, and 1 purple blue, and 1 white beige. So the whole rainbow. And the other thing you want to be doing is and there are a number of things you want to be doing, but you want to eliminate as far as possible refined carbohydrates. And you know, the mainstream world right now has their banner up against carbohydrates, and they say, get rid of carbohydrates, especially if you have diabetes. But what they're forgetting is that the healthiest people in the world, if you look at the blue zones, the healthiest people in the world, 50 to 80% of their calories come from carbohydrates. See, the thing is there are really a couple different categories of carbohydrates. When carbohydrates come in the form of whole plant foods, they're naturally packaged with fiber and phytochemicals and antioxidants, and they're very protective to health. When you strip everything of value in the carbohydrate foods from the carbohydrates before you eat it, it's a problem. And so, you know, we take a reasonable carbohydrate food and, you know, like a grain of wheat, for example, we remove the germ and the bran and we're left with pure starch. And of course, as I mentioned in my lecture, nobody eats a bowl of white flour. You make white flour out of a whole grain, and before you eat it, you add sugar and fat and salt and artificial colors and preservatives, and then you eat it, and you're eating garbage. You're not only have you removed what's of value in the original food, you've added all of these harmful compounds to it makes things much worse. And 90% of the carbohydrates people are eating are refined. So it makes a huge difference whether or not you're getting your carbohydrates from sugar and white flour products versus lentils and sweet potatoes. It's a very different ballgame. And so that's number 2, is getting rid of refined carbohydrates. Number 3 is you want to get your protein from plant foods rather than animal products. And we have many studies that have compared sources of protein and risk of diabetes or progression of diabetes. And what we see is very strongly, there was a study out of Harvard that looked at over 200,000 people. And what they found was that the intake of animal protein was strongly associated with diabetes risk, whereas the intake of plant protein was associated with reduced risk. And they actually quantified this, showing that for every 5% protein consumed, If you replace the 5% animal protein with plant protein, you would reduce your risk of diabetes by 23%. So just shocking. And there have been a number of studies. There was another study from 2014 where they found that in looking at people over 50 years of age, those that consumed 20% or more of their calories from protein had 4 times the risk of diabetes in people between 50 and 65, and in people over 65, they had 10 times higher risk of diabetes when 20% of your calories came from protein. But the caveat is that this was only true if the protein came from animal foods. If the protein came from plant foods, the risk was pretty much abolished, or at least greatly attenuated. Again, we just have a number of studies showing people are better off with plant protein. You see, when you compare animal and plant protein, the plant protein contains fiber, it contains phytochemicals, it contains antioxidants, it contains a lot of anti-inflammatory and just nutrients that are protective. Whereas with meat, you've got a lot more pro-oxidants. You've got new 5-GC, which is a pro-inflammatory molecule. You've got saturated fat, which tends to be pro-inflammatory. You form TMAO from the carnitine in meat, which is inflammatory and is very atherogenic. And the heme iron, which is a pro-oxidant. And there are just all kinds of things that can contribute to oxidative stress and inflammation. So we want to get our protein more from plant foods. And then fat is another macronutrient, and we have to consider sources of fat as well. And when you get your fat from processed foods or animal products, you tend to be getting more trans fatty acids and more saturated fat, again, which can contribute to insulin resistance and problems. So we recommend lowering your total fat, but getting most of your fat from whole plant foods, like nuts and seeds, for example. The other features of the diet that you need to consider are certainly you want to make sure that you're getting all the nutrients you need. And for diabetes, we think of things like potassium and magnesium that are very, very critical nutrients, vitamin D and so forth. So you want the diet to be very well balanced. And then you need to load up on these protective components like antioxidants and phytochemicals, which again are, these phytochemicals are just chemicals in plants. So these are the component, and fiber, of course, as well. These again, only plants, only plants, only plants. And that's the broken record, is the things that protect us are in plants. And so, all these people on ketogenic diets and diets that are eliminating plants and saying, eat all this fat and meat, they're forgetting that they're eliminating the most protective compounds in the diet, and they're concentrating the things that are most harmful. It makes no sense at all. So in fiber, I would say you need probably, ideally, 40 to 50, 60 grams in the diet every day, which means at least 12 to 15 or 20 grams per meal, which means, where do we get them? Certainly not from meat. There's zero fiber in meat, fish, poultry. There's no fiber in sugar. There's no fiber in oil even. So you want to be relying more on whole foods. The other thing that we need to consider is all of these compounds that contribute to oxidative stress and I think of all of the chemical contaminants in foods, like the pesticides and herbicides and all of the heavy metals and the persistent organic pollutants that move up the food chain. And these compounds, obviously we want to choose organic where we can, but a lot of these compounds, again, are concentrated in animal products because they move up the food chain. So we want to eat lower down, which means eating more plant foods. And then the other group are the products of oxidation formed from cooking. So when we cook at very high temperatures, especially deep frying, we produce compounds and products of oxidation that are very harmful to human health. And so thinking about frying, we produce advanced glycation end products, and when you cook starchy foods at high temperature, you can produce acrylamide. And when you cook meat at high temperature, you produce heterocyclic amines. And when you blacken any food, you produce polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And all of these things, not only are they carcinogenic, but they tend to be quite inflammatory. inflammatory. And so when you're trying to fight a disease that is very associated with inflammation, you want to really get rid of those things. And so it means preparing foods more, eating more raw foods, but preparing foods using moist cooking methods like steaming more often. And really avoiding high temperatures when you do cook with dry heat. And then of course the critical thing is to try to avoid being overweight. And this is something that I'm actually finding quite interesting because, of course, in the United States and Canada, well, in the United States right now, 70% of the population is either overweight or obese. And this is an absolutely stunning figure. In the United States, you are an abnormality. You're abnormal if you're normal weight. And so people who are normal weight, often people say to them, you're so skinny. Because the norm is being overweight. And so they're not used to seeing people of normal weight. It's crazy. But anyway, in Europe, not so much so. But what I find very interesting is that even 5 pounds of excess weight can contribute to insulin resistance. It doesn't take much. And so one story that I find quite fascinating is when I was in Taiwan to do a lecture on this topic, I met a lady who was not much difference in size from me. She was about 5'3" and 115 pounds, which is what, 60 kilos. And 53 kilos, something like that. And she was diabetic. She had type 2 diabetes. And I looked at her and I thought, how can she have diabetes? She's so slim. But what I realized is she was probably 10 or 15 pounds above her healthy weight because she was an Asian lady with very small bones. And so even though we look at her and say, wow, she's lean, why would she have diabetes? In Asia, the normal weight is lower and people need to be lean, and even that much excess weight, especially in the Asian population, can cause diabetes. And so some people think they're lean enough, but for their physiological stature, they may be carrying a little bit of extra weight that's contributing to insulin resistance, and they actually need to be really lean to get rid of it. It's quite interesting. I mean, for most people, they're quite overweight to have type 2 diabetes, but not everyone. So this is quite interesting as well. But to me, the good news, and this is really good news, is I think most people with type 2 diabetes can overcome this disease completely if they are motivated, and that's a big if. There's a fellow in the UK who's doing some work. His name is Roy Taylor, and he did this twin cycles hypothesis for diabetes, and it's a very interesting research. And there are 2 cases there where they found diabetes, insulin resistance could be erased in a week. And one was they did gastric bypass surgery. And with gastric bypass surgery, the fat in the liver declines so rapidly that insulin resistance gets reversed even before intramyocellular lipids are gone. And then the second was feeding people an extremely low calorie diet, like 600 to 800 calories a day, and they could get diabetes, the insulin resistance to be gone in a week. Now, people aren't going to live on 600 to 800 calories, but what's really interesting is if you can get rid of that fat in the liver, you see insulin resistance disappear. And so even if we do it slightly more gradually over time with a plant-based, lower fat, plant-based, no sugar added diet, we can see reversal of diabetes in fairly short order. It's quite remarkable. I've seen some pretty amazing recoveries, and people who get off all their medication and have normal fasting glucose levels. And that's the good news. And the other good news is to me, I mean, it could be bad news to some, it could be good news to some, but there is nobody on this planet that can eat or exercise for you. You are the captain of that ship. And so you really have control over that. So it's not like you go to a doctor and he writes out a prescription for a medication and then, your blood sugars are controlled for the next 20 years, but you still develop all the complications and you die of the disease. In this case, you can actually change what you choose to put in your body, and because of your choices, you can reverse this disease, be in total control. Get off the crappy medications that, will not reduce your risk of complications in the long run. And it's a miracle of sorts in my view, but what is so wonderful is your body wants to be healthy. It wants to heal itself. All it needs is the raw material with which to rebuild the body tissues so it can be healthy again. And you can do it. It's totally in your control. And the other thing is that there are people around you within your country who want to help you do that, who would be willing to help you make that transition. So it's really quite a wonderful thing. And I think everybody has it within themselves to do that. And sometimes it helps to go to a place where they can feed you 3 meals a day. And so you don't have to actually do it yourself, but to do an intervention. And that can be very empowering. And once you've tasted the food and you've done it and you see the results, then it's all good news.